In fact, if you look at the way that I teach, uh, my goal is to it's a common thread through everything I teach. And by the way, I am expanding to teach other things other than tithing, and that's relatively new for me um, to go beyond that. And but however, the common thread is really talking to I'm really talking to people who already call themselves Christians, okay, but are under various kinds of bondages, disciplines that are actually only religious as opposed to a mark of a true Christian.
Mm. Kind of like churchianity instead of Christianity.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay, Russ, do you have any comments based on what George talked about?
Not really.
Okay, then let's get on to the second question. What is the best argument that tithe teachers, those who are pro-tithing, what's the best argument that they have in their favor, and then why is it wrong?
The best argument is that Abraham practiced tithing before the law, and therefore somehow that is supposed to prove that tithing must be an eternal moral principle. The problem with this argument is there are several things wrong with it. First of all, nothing Abraham did in Genesis 14 concerning tithing is followed by churches today as an example of faith. First, that which Abraham gave was only from pagan spoils of war. And it was not a holy tithe off of God's holy land. It did not meet the definition of tithe under the Mosaic law. Number two, Abraham did not tithe any of his own possessions. That's not an example of giving by faith. And number three, Abraham kept nothing for himself. He gave the 90% to the king of Sodom. And that is definitely not an example of what we should do by faith. Second, there is no principle which says, and this is implied in all of the tithe teachers, they seem to think that it is implied in what they say that if something is very old and very common, then it must be an eternal moral principle. That kind of logic, to me, would force us to accept idol worship, child sacrifices, and temple prostitution, along with tithing, because all three of them are very old and very common. But they don't use those arguments yet they use the same argument for tithing. I urge friends to research Genesis 14, verse 21, in at least 10 different commentaries. And surprisingly, you will discover that Abraham was probably obeying what I call pagan Arab tradition. And he didn't give the tithe because he wanted to. He gave the tithe because he had to in order to follow that tradition.
Okay, when you say there's a false argument that because it's ancient, it basically is kind of an eternal principle, and then you mentioned child sacrifice, for example, I could imagine a Christian saying, well, yeah, but, the Jews are God's people, and they never practiced child sacrifice, so how is that relevant?
Because they go back before the Jews were God's people. They go back to Abraham.
Yeah, but Abraham, for example, did not do child sacrifice, right?
Well, the trouble is the Canaanite religion, which completely surrounded Abraham in that time of history, did.
Mm-hmm.
It was well known. Anybody that would go to the public library and study Canaanite religion will see that they were so defiled in everything they did that that's why God allowed them to be killed off. Their worship was terrible, and to pick out tithing as something, oh, that's good, and throw out everything else the Canaanites did, it just doesn't make sense. There's no logic. There's no principle of interpretation there that can be continued on.
What about also like animal sacrifice? For example, that's as early as Abel, so somebody might argue that that's an eternal thing, but then now we have Jesus who did away with that, and we don't do that anymore. Is that kind of the same argument that you're having?
Not necessarily, because that is definitely reputed, abolished in the New Testament, because Christ became the Passover for us.
Mm-hmm.
But we're talking about things that are not clearly discussed. To say that Abraham's tithe was an example for all Christians to tithe does not make sense, because nothing Abraham did is followed by Christians today and shouldn't be.
Yeah, and
10% outside of the Bible. In the Word of God, the word tithe is always coupled with a tithe of food. It is never a tithe by in and of itself. When you leave Abraham and go into the Mosaic Law, there are 16 Bible texts that describe the contents of the biblical tithe, and it is always only food from inside the Holy Land of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
So we differ with their definition of tithe coming out of a secular dictionary.
That's a good point. That's one point that I try to make, is that nowadays we have a thing called the Christian tithe that Christians made up, but there actually is a definition of what the tithe is in the Old Testament, and you can look up these verses, and it says exactly who's the tithe, when the tithe, what the tithe, and all that kind of stuff. Is that true?
That's true. The Christian has redefined the word tithe, and they've given it an entirely new context.
Okay. George, I'll ask you what you think the number one best argument that tithe teachers have, but first off, do you have any comments to what Russ said about Abraham, the example for Abraham for tithing?
No, I don't. But to answer your question, I would agree with Russell's assessment, and that is that the tithe teachers lean heavily on the Abraham experience, the Abraham's tithing to Melchizedek. I want to add to what he said to point out that, see, Abraham did a lot of things. Okay, did a lot of things, both good and bad. And if you step back and look at the big picture, here we are in the New Testament, and the tithe teachers tell us, go back in there and look at what Abraham did with the tithe. Well, stop. There ought to be some consistency. What about other things that Abraham did? Okay, why do we pick out that one thing? I completed a teaching, and it's available now online. It's called God the Promise Keeper. In that teaching, I take a look at 7 major errors that Abraham did. Okay, Abraham was guilty of several major things that he did wrong. Why don't we don't pick those up and say, see, Abraham did it, and therefore we ought to do those too? We don't do that. Okay. For instance, God told Abraham to leave his family, leave everybody, and to go where he would tell him to go. Well, Abraham partially obeyed that. He packed up and headed out like he was supposed to. However, he took Lot with him. Right? That wasn't what God told him to do. And if you trace back through the things that happened with Abraham, you'll see that God did not speak to Abraham again until he and Lot separated. Okay? So, Abraham sold his wife out. Right? But sold his wife out. Let me define sold his wife out. There's a popular term these days, pimp, P-I-M-P, pimp, right? You hear it in terms of a TV show, Pimp My Ride, where you take a car and you put a ridiculous amount of gadgets, etc., on it, and you make it look real fancy, things like that. Well, that's not where that term started. What it really means is to take advantage of usually a woman, okay, for we put it this way, Abraham did the same sort of thing, all right? He convinced his wife to be willing to become part of the king's harem in order to protect his own life. Okay, hiding behind his wife's skirt, all right, putting her at risk. This is Father Abraham. Okay, nobody talks about that. I don't hear preachers saying, "Oh yeah, we ought to do it because Abraham did it." No, that logic does not make sense. Okay, neither does it make sense to say because Abraham gave a tenth of something that we ought to do it too. So for a lot of reasons, just like Russ pointed out, that is a false teaching, false, incorrect, erroneous. It's very terrible in my mind.